Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Joustra, coming to you from NAM, Melbourne, Australia. Let's begin. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode. Today we're going to be talking about community roots, fostering eco-friendly communities. And we're talking with Karen Magruder, who is the Assistant Professor of Practice at the University of Texas at Arlington. Hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And you've got quite an interesting history, I believe. So do you mind introducing yourself in a bit more detail?
Absolutely. So I am a social worker. That's my main trade, I guess you could say. But I didn't start that way. I always, maybe a bit idyllically, wanted to be in a career that helped people and that made a difference. And what I thought that looked like in my undergraduate, college studies were nonprofit management and psychology. So those were the things that I mainly studied in university. And I worked at the American Cancer Society, where I was doing fundraising and volunteer management and program management and more of the macro side of helping people, I guess you could say, and more administrative. And I saw these patient navigators who were social workers, and they were helping the cancer patients on the front lines. And I thought, man, I would love to also get that same type of direct practice experience to be able to make more of a difference, boots on the ground, so to speak. And so I went back and earned a master's degree in social work. And a lot of people assume that social workers just do child welfare, but social workers are actually in so many different places, in healthcare and mental health and schools and many different places. And so I got actually the opportunity to work with a lot of different populations. I did some refugee resettlement and some mental health counseling, and worked even in a prison setting, and most professionally, I guess you could say, the thing that I did for the longest time was working in the aging field, so in long-term care, nursing homes, and assisted livings. And I had always loved nature. I had always enjoyed being out in natural settings, and I was very fortunate to be able to travel quite a bit. And so I'd seen a lot of the world and really tried to be a good environmental steward and recycle and, cut down my carbon footprint and all those things. But I never really saw any kind of connection between environmentalism, sustainability, and my role as a social worker in more of a social service and social justice setting, until there was a hurricane that came through in the area where I was practicing, Hurricane Harvey. And a lot of the older adults, the seniors that I worked with, were really impacted. A lot of the long-term care communities didn't have emergency evacuation plans that were as robust and thought out as they could be. There was a lot of flooding. There were a lot of issues with the types of folks that I was serving, who often had mobility issues or things like that. And many of them had a fixed, limited income, maybe less of a social support network. And so I really saw how these existing vulnerabilities, these social vulnerabilities, turned into making it harder for them to cope and bounce back when a natural disaster or extreme weather event struck. So that was kind of my light bulb moment of realizing, hey, wait a minute, there actually is an intersection between environmental stuff, which I thought was just, for scientists, and social service work. And so that kind of got me started on my journey. And I wanted to learn a lot more about climate change and green social work or eco-social work and ways that I could meld the two together. And then, of course, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I started seeing it everywhere. For example, at the time I was living in Texas, which is a pretty warm state, and we had an annual summer air conditioning drive where the nonprofit that I worked with would get air conditioning units donated and installed for low-income seniors in the community. And every summer, the demand got higher and higher and higher and higher. And knowing about how our climate is changing and how those extreme heat events are becoming more frequent, realizing again, okay, people like me in the nonprofit world are going to have to step up to help meet these needs, particularly again with people who are already vulnerable, in this case, seniors. As we get older, our bodies physiologically have a harder time regulating temperature. And so it's like these, these vulnerabilities just stack on top of each other and really intersect. So I got some more education and training in this area. And then since then, I've just been active in some community organizing, nonprofits that do environmental work in the community, as well as some research about environmental justice. And as an educator, now I'm a full-time faculty member. And so primarily I do a lot of education about climate change and about the social work role and social service role in climate related issues. And so I do research, teaching. I don't know what else to say about what I currently do. I am also pursuing a doctoral degree in social work. And one of the things that I've been looking at through my doctorate has been eco-anxiety, this idea that there's a lot of distress and fear over both impacts of the climate crisis as well as other environmental issues like nuclear waste disposal or plastic pollution, that type of thing. And so looking at how we can address those types of fears and concerns from a mental health perspective. So that's where I got to where I am now.
There's a lot there. And I'm very interested to see understand more about that intersection. You've given us a very brief glimpse into, how climate change can affect people who are maybe less advantaged, but definitely looking forward to learning more about that. But before we do, we're going to do a section called Have You Met Karen, where we get to know you through some of your favorite things. And the first thing I'd like to know is, what is your favorite book?
It is so hard to choose a favorite book, honestly, but one of several books that have really made a big impact on me was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And for those unfamiliar, it's a really powerful philosophical memoir that explores his experience as a Holocaust survivor and then his development later as a mental health clinician of logotherapy, which is a form of psychotherapy that really emphasizes the importance of finding meaning in every aspect of your life, that even in the midst of unimaginable suffering, we can endure any of those circumstances if we have a why or a sense of purpose. I found it really inspiring and empowering as well, that we have the choice, regardless of what circumstances we find ourselves in, to choose that mindset and attitude and building a path forward. And I think it's a real picture of resilience.
I think that I think like many people, I'm searching for the meaning of what I want to do and why I want to do it. So I very much, I think, resonate with that. And I'll have to read it and see how it can help me maybe.
Absolutely.
And you said there were some other books, or did you want to, just leave that one as the main one?
I think I'll leave that as the main one. Otherwise,
Okay.
It'll be just a book club.
Yeah. I don't mind that. But yes, that's not why we've got you here today. And so have you watched any movies that you've enjoyed recently?
It's not really a movie, but it's a mini series show that was on Netflix called Scenes from a Marriage with Oscar Isaac and Jessica Chastain. And it's a mini series. And what I loved about it, well, several things. The acting was phenomenal. I always really enjoy movies or shows where it almost feels like you're a fly on the wall and it's a real conversation happening and not something that's, a played out drama. And so that was really excellent. But I also loved that it built so much tension. It was almost like a thriller, but it was a drama. But it was like I was on the edge of my seat, and it also covered some pretty taboo topics in a really brave and I think thought-provoking way. And having been a therapist and a couples therapist, I thought it was really interesting to kind of get a peek inside some of the turmoil and, conversations and things that might happen behind closed doors. So I thought it was one of those binge watching series that I just couldn't wait to see what the next episode was going to be. So that was the most recent one that I couldn't put down.
Sounds really good. And I love the idea. I love that you've brought in, you're a therapist, but you also love seeing how these people interact, I guess maybe in a way that they do when other people aren't around, even a therapist.
That's what I like too about, I have to, guilty confession here. My guilty pleasure is reality shows. I like reality TV sometimes. Some are a little too fake or scripted feeling for me. But when there's those moments where it's a real conversation, I just find it, I studied psychology. I just find it really interesting to see how people communicate. Maybe that makes me a bit of a voyeur, but I really find it interesting to watch those things unfold. And I actually often take scenes from things like that to the classroom and say, okay, what's a more effective way that this person could have communicated the sentiment, in a more productive way? Because that's a lot of what we do in therapy is helping people communicate more effectively and expressing their emotions and coping with that. So.
It's great that, you can actually bring maybe some real life examples into the class, because sometimes, you watch those videos, they feel very fake. So, something that is on TV maybe still feels a bit fake, but maybe closer to real life. And, reality TV is educational. I love that.
It can be.
And do you listen to any podcasts?
Oh, well, this is a tricky question when a podcaster asks you what kind of podcast you're listening to. I'm going to give you a little roundabout answer. It's not technically a podcast. It's a YouTube channel that is fun to watch, but also just to listen to. And it's called The Productivity Game. And it's a series of short, concise, very engaging, memorable summaries of books on leadership or business or professional development, time management, self-help genre type stuff, but often kind of with a business or entrepreneurial lens. And so for those who like self-improvement, I love reading those types of things, but it takes a long time and you don't always have time for that. And so the Productivity Game, other than the fact that they're fun to listen to and watch and really informative, but it's so short that it kind of gives you the main snippets in a really helpful packaged way that then will allow me to decide, okay, I feel like I've gotten the main insights from that book, check on to the next. Or, wow, this sounds really interesting. Maybe I do want to rent this from the library or whatever to get a closer peek at it. So I think I appreciate what I learn from the videos, but as an educator, I also really appreciate the way that it's presented in such a compelling, accessible way.
I love that because, I think reading all those, books, reading takes time and, you have to really want to, and you don't know if you've got the right book or not. If you can at least get, a synopsis of what it's about, then maybe you can decide if it's going to work for you.
Absolutely. And that's one, again, I'm always trying to give resources and recommendations to my students, or I also do clinical supervision for folks that are working on getting their social work licensure. And I'll often say, well, you just have to watch this video. And it's just a short overview that helps to explain some topics really effectively.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And do you have a role model?
I do. You've probably never heard of him. His name is Mr. Gianelli, and he was my high school history teacher. And he has always been one of my role models. He was a good teacher, but it wasn't even anything related to any particularly stellar pedagogical methods in terms of teaching. It was more just who he was as a person. He was so thoughtful and genuine, and he just really cared for students and made you feel seen. I moved cities in the middle of high school, and so the first high school I went to was very large. I was in a very rigorous academic program that was challenging, and I moved to a smaller town, and the coursework was a little bit easier, but the biggest culture shock, I guess you could say, is that it didn't feel like you were a number anymore. It was such more of a personal connection to people as students and a human to human relationship. Still appropriate, right? Appropriate boundaries and all of that, but just more connected and personal. And if I was obviously having a bad day, he would offer me a granola bar, and I didn't need the food. Thankfully, I wasn't struggling with food insecurity at home, but it was still just such a touching gesture of care that he noticed that I was off and that he wanted to do something to cheer me up and support me. And he just saw me as a real person and not just a student, not just, whatever, and not just a scholar. And now I take that approach with my students as a professor. I don't have, a giant box of granola bars that I'm hurling out to everybody in the class necessarily, but more just the idea of the importance of just being authentic, caring about them as humans, and rooting for their success in and out of the classroom. And the other thing that thinking about Mr. Gianelli helps me with is actually with how you handle constructive feedback and criticism. By nature, I've always been a pretty sensitive person, and thankfully I've developed a little bit of thicker skin over time, and I've tried to grow in that area, and I have. But whenever, I get feedback that isn't easy to hear, I try to have that growth mindset and, okay, great, this is going to make me better and whatnot. But I think of him because I thought this man walked on water. I thought he was just the kindest person ever. And one day I was talking to one of my friends and she goes, I hate Mr. Gianelli. And I said, what? How on earth could you? He's the sweetest guy, And I was just floored that my friend just hated him. And even though I continue to do my best, again, to be the best that I can be, to take feedback with an open mind and receptivity, if I ever feel defeated, like I can't please everybody, I just remember that neither could Mr. Gianelli. And that if somebody didn't like Mr. Gianelli, then there's sure going to be at least a few people that aren't going to like me either. And that always just helps me to not take myself so seriously and do the best that I can and just move forward.
I think that's a really great piece of advice because, I think we all want to, well, at least I want to please everyone, and it's impossible. And you have to just sort of, I guess, let it go if it's not possible. Even if the nicest person in the world can't get someone to like them, then that's it. And my last question is, have you completed any courses that have inspired you?
Many. I am a nerd, and I always said that if I won the lottery, I would be a professional student. Unfortunately, I haven't won the lottery and been able to just collect degrees, but I work in academia, which I guess is the next best thing. And so there's been a lot of courses that have really opened up my eyes, but I'm actually going to tell you about one from that same high school, different teacher. It was a class called Peers, and it was basically being a peer leader, a peer mentor, peer counseling. So it was a lot of leadership and socio-emotional skill development, and it was led by our school counselor. And it was a great introduction to those concepts in psychology and social service that are now my professional world. So I just really realized that a lot of the things that we learned in school, geometry and history and all those types of things, can be really important, but we're also not always taught some of those things about how to communicate, how to identify and express your emotions, how to resolve conflict, and so forth, how to be a good listener. And so it really, I think, taught me some things in a very intentional, direct way that it would have taken me a lot longer to have just learned through trial and error of life to learn all of those same skills. And it was also led by that school counselor who was another role model of mine. She was just really so focused on service to others. And she had traveled all over the world and just marched to the beat of her own drum in such a confident way. She was just very authentically herself. And I loved it. And so both the content and the people that I met as a result of that really inspired me to travel, to serve others, and to just be yourself and go your own path that calls to you.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think that class sounds really, really great because, my school, we did so much about, science and maths and all of that, but we don't actually learn how to do some of those really basic life skills like listening and how to, settle an argument. You just sort of, go to the teachers and they kind of do it for you. So yeah, sounds like a really great class and a really great teacher. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I would love for things like that to be a bigger part of curriculums everywhere. And I know that there's only so many hours in the day and there's testing and you got to get into the next level of school achievement. But I think it's really valuable to have those types of life skill type supports in addition to the more traditional academic content.
So before we get started with the interview, or as the beginning part of our interview, I like to, have a few definitions so that we, all know that we're starting off from the same place. So the first thing I'd like you to define is household management.
Absolutely. And I find this a really interesting question because I have to be honest that before working with you, that wasn't something that was a part of my everyday vernacular. The way that I conceptualize that is that households are simultaneously a family, a community, even in some ways sort of like a business to run. And so I think of household management as the planning, organization, coordination of activities and resources within a household to make sure that everybody within that household is functioning smoothly in daily life, being able to meet the goals of its members. And so that could be anything from finances to meal prep and planning, maintenance, cleaning, but also communication, caring for everybody. So that's kind of what I envision the idea of household management to be. Is that in line with how you all define it?
Yes, I think so. I mean, you've given quite a broad definition, but I think particularly the words, said smooth functioning of everyone in the household, I think most key because it's making sure that everything that the household needs, and that's including things like laundry, food, is all working. I'm interested though, because you included within household community, which I've never considered before. I considered my household to be me, my partner, my cat, the food we eat, the laundry, maybe the furniture that within our plants, but not necessarily the people around us. So do you mind explaining how community falls into household management?
That's a great question. It's because you're talking to a social worker. That's why. So, in social work, one of our foundational theories is called person and environment. And it's the idea that perhaps more a traditional psychologist might be looking just at someone's cognitions, their mental health, their feelings, maybe their thoughts or behaviors. But people don't exist in a vacuum. Individuals don't, and households don't. So, there's these systems, kind of like a Russian nesting doll. And so I agree with you that I would also say that a household is really just the members of that individual household. But it's hard for me to really separate that from the community context in which that household lives. So where I live with my dog and my partner is that household is going to look really different if I'm living in a big city or in a rural area or in country A or country B. And so, or in a really liberal area or a very conservative area. And so that's kind of what I mean when I'm talking about the community, is just that the household influences the community, and the community certainly influences the members of the household and how that functions as well.
Okay. And so I guess would it be correct to say that, if you're in a community that is similar to you or shares similar values, you're going to be a better household because you're in a better community for you. Whereas if you're in a community that maybe doesn't share values or doesn't make you feel safe and secure, you're not going to have as good a household, or good as functioning in the household.
I think that's a good hypothesis. I assume that there's got to be some goodness of fit, that there's maybe not one ideal place to live, city, community that would universally be heaven for everybody that goes there. But there's going to be places that will help you thrive, and there's going to be other communities that are going to present more obstacles or roadblocks based on who you are and what you want in life and what your resources and circumstances are. So I do think that if a community has access to nature and a strong social support network and good weather and a strong economy and lots of opportunities and so on and so forth, it's going to make it easier for the households in that community to thrive and function smoothly than it would be in a community where there are more problems, or a community where there's ideological differences or different paths of how they, want life to unfold. That's obviously going to create some tension and conflict as well.
So it's not just, maybe ideological values. It's also, as you're saying, economic, environmental, climate,
social, political.
Yeah. There's so many things that go into it. And I guess, you're going to have maybe a better time, a better functioning household if you share those values, but also if you have a good education system around you for your kids, if you have, good economics, you have enough money and people around you have enough money.
Yeah, and part of even transportation, part of my household is based on where we live. We have to have a car in order to function. There's a lot of other communities where there's a more robust public transportation system. And so that's something that they can rely on as a public good rather than a personal responsibility. So all of these things impact what happens in the household, I think.
As you were saying before, that you saw the intersection of community and environmental practices, sustainability, climate change, all of those things. Can you explain a bit more about the intersection and how they also affect our households and how they run?
Absolutely. So let me start with how our community impacts let me start with how the environment impacts the functioning of a household. So I live in the desert in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's very, very, very hot. It's the hottest city in the United States. And so there can be a real strain on the power grid. So when there is a really hot summer day and everybody is cranking their air conditioning, there can be risks of brownouts or blackouts or power failure things. And so that impacts how we manage our electricity consumption in the home. It caused us to get solar panels. We wanted to be environmentally friendly and have renewable energy, of course. But secondarily, it's also a helpful backup that if and when these heat waves get worse, we aren't reliant on the grid so much. It also impacts what we do in our household. So when it's really hot outside, we're staying indoors. We're, to the extent possible, not spending a lot of time outdoors, even in our yard. So that's just one example, of course, and there's many different contexts for that. But what's happening in the natural or physical built environment around us is, of course, going to impact our behaviors and what we do in our household. And then conversely, what we do as a household impacts the environment. Just thinking about our carbon footprints and our emissions, how much electricity we use, how much water we use, those types of things. Of course, climate change is bigger. The greenhouse effect is bigger than just individual households, right? There's transportation and industrial operations, businesses, of course. But homes and families are a part of that as well. And a lot of times it's natural to feel like I'm just one person or we're just one household. I can't make a difference. But if everybody thought that way, we wouldn't be in a good spot. And it takes everybody's individual contributions to having more sustainable practices in the household to move towards those solutions of having a more habitable planet for all of us.
Okay. So just to I'm going to put out maybe a thought that I'm having.
Yeah, please.
So now I don't live in Sydney, but I have heard that there are parts of Sydney that when there's a heat wave get much hotter than other parts of Sydney, just because I think of the way that the land has been used or the construction, the buildings that have been created. And the parts that get really, really hot are the areas that are lower socioeconomically. So I guess in some ways how different communities can be impacted is if all the people in the rich areas or in the higher socioeconomic areas crank up their air conditioning and they don't have any sustainability models like solar panels, then they're going to use a lot of the electricity. And even if they do run out of, even if there is a power outage, they might have solar panels and they might have a backup system. People in lower socioeconomic areas might not have that. They're in a hotter area. They need the air conditioning more than people in the higher socioeconomic areas. Is that kind of how this whole thing is working? It's impacting households, it's the community, and it's also the environment.
Yes, I'm smiling so much because I'm like, she gets it. Absolutely, you are right on the money. So you're describing the urban heat island effect, and that happens in big cities everywhere where more urban centers in the city tend to have more concrete, less trees, and more industrial operations, more pollution, and so forth. And that makes those urban centers hotter, even if weather-wise it's identical from the city center to, several kilometers away. You're still going to have that bubble, if you will, that island of heat in the middle of the city center. So it's cooler outside of the city, regardless of, weather. But as you said, that's just the environmental piece. Then there's another layer, which is the equity piece, which you also touched on, which is that those same areas that tend to be warmer also tend to have fewer resources, individuals who have, lower incomes and so forth. And so that's again where the alignment with my field, social work, comes into play, because it's not just a scientific environmental issue we need to solve. There's also layers of social justice and equity there, and the potential for these gaps to widen, because exactly like you said, folks who have the ability to crank their air conditioning do so, and they're comfortable, but now they're emitting more and they're straining the power grid more. And it just can kind of snowball from there. So that's an excellent example of that intersection between environmental and social issues.
Thank you. And I guess my next question is, how do we make it more equitable? How do we as a community and as individuals, I guess, work towards making it more equitable, and I guess trying to, remedy some of the impact that we're having on the environment?
So there are a lot of things, thankfully. I love talking about solutions and opportunities, because it can understandably feel really overwhelming when you look at the enormity of not just climate change, but other environmental issues, how we dispose of toxic waste and pollution and all sorts of things. And I think it's really important to have awareness about those things and then act on it. So step one, as I alluded to, is awareness, educating yourself and then sharing that knowledge with others in your sphere of influence. I'm in a fortunate position that I get to have a captive audience with my students and other, venues where I get to speak more publicly about these issues. But you don't have to have that to spread awareness. You just have to know people and talk to people. And you can start with your little sphere of influence, your family, your friends, your coworkers, and so forth, about what's on your mind and what you're learning about. So that education piece, I think, is where you start from. But then there's also a difference between knowing and doing. So that awareness is really important, but it's not the whole story. People know that these issues exist, and just that knowledge doesn't solve them. So there's individual actions that you can take, a lot of different things that you can do to reduce your own carbon footprint, whether that be reducing your electric and, water or gas consumption, being more minimalistic in general, buying less things, consumerism, when you're buying a new shirt or something like that you don't need, there was water and fabric and labor and transportation that all went into making that item. So even just consuming a little bit less can be a powerful way. One thing that's really tangible that I feel like is so doable is eating less meat and animal products. So many people don't realize that a lot more resources go into raising a chicken or a pig or a cow than there are in terms of land, space, and water and so forth for vegetables. And so again, a lot of these environmental solutions also have positive social impacts. So this is a good example of that in addition to being friendly to the animals and thinking more from an animal rights perspective and non-violence and non-harming and so forth, it's actually one of the easiest ways to reduce your impact on the environment is ideally to not, have meat, but even just starting small with less of that, because there's significantly less resources that are required and less emissions in terms of methane, especially from cattle and so forth. So there are a lot of different things you can do on the individual level, biking instead of driving. I mean, I could go on, and I think a lot of people are already aware of those things, of recycling and composting and all of that stuff. And those individual actions matter, but collective actions matter more. And it's really only when we come together as almost like links in a chain that we can really make a big difference. And it's not an either or, it's a both and. We have to do those individual actions. And I think it's important to Also, take action on issues that are relevant to you and your community and that you're passionate about. So we can't solve everything. As one person, there's no way that you can address every social issue in your region. But you can pick one thing that you want to learn more about and address. And maybe that means joining a community organization, volunteering your time, to plant trees or to pick up trash or whatever the case might be. Or maybe it's more political, advocacy to support policies that are good for the environment and the well-being of the society. And just, I think that advocacy piece, I had a coworker at a previous job whose slogan was, "Democracy is not a spectator sport." And that always really stuck with me, that you and I, even being in different countries, we're fortunate to have the ability to be empowered, to have some say to a degree or another in the political process. And sure, maybe that means voting for the highest levels of office in the country, but you can make such a big difference in your local community as well. I teach a social welfare policy course, and one of the assignments is that they have to go to a city council meeting where they go to a local meeting with elected officials. And one of the things that my learners are always so surprised at is how anyone can just go. Like, I just showed up at this meeting and I could talk and I could give my opinion. And on a local level, whether that be, a neighborhood association or city, whatever the case may be, there's a lot more opportunity to make changes on that level. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's a lot to think about. Yeah, that's so just finding, I guess, the organizations within your community that you are passionate about and also getting involved in your local government. So local city council, and maybe speaking up and, you want more green spaces in your city council. So talk to someone in the city council and say, I want some more green spaces. That's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Absolutely. That's a great summary. And I think it's also important to think about using your own unique skills and knowledge and talents and passions. My way of doing things is in education, but your way of doing things might be in art, maybe through, artwork or poetry or song, or maybe through science and technology and invention, or maybe through writing and blogging, maybe through social media, right? There are all these different ways that we can leverage skills or talents that we already have and make that unique contribution. I think kind of, it's like that metaphor of the body working together. Not everybody's a hand or a foot, but we all can kind of play a role in our own places and in our own ways that are meaningful to us to address these issues.
And what happens if you live in an area where maybe your values aren't as represented? You live in an area where you want more green spaces, but people don't really, want to support that. Or you'd like, like green waste collection rather than going straight into landfill, but no one else is. It's not really high on the list of anyone else's priorities. Is it just a matter of moving somewhere else and finding a community that's more similar to you? Or, is there any way you can change your community?
I mean, my instinct wants to say, get the heck out of there, but that's not actually a real answer. No, I'm kidding. What I see is an opportunity in that if you are in a place that is not aligned with the values and things that you want to see, there may be times where there's such a severe misalignment that there's a safety issue or whatever, and it would be best to be somewhere else. But to a degree, I like the cliche of bloom where you're planted. And I think that being behind enemy lines, so to speak, can actually be an opportunity to make an even bigger difference. When I talk to new social workers in the field, sometimes they'll talk about these social issues that just seem, and not just environmental, I mean, name your issue related to healthcare or housing or whatever the case may be. And they feel really daunted by that. And I want to validate that. And at the same time, it's like, this is what we're here for. This is an opportunity for us to make a difference. This is seeing something that needs to change and having more possibilities, if you will. So maybe that's a bit overly positive and simplified. I know it's not so easy as just running in there and, telling your point of view and saving the day. But I do think that there's some advantage actually to having, in the context of environmentalism, people who really care about their environment and their communities in places where maybe historically that hasn't been as high of a priority, because that's where it's actually needed the most.
Yeah, I guess if you are living in a community that is already very focused on sustainability, and you're doing all those practices, that's really great. You're probably minimizing your impact, and you've got a lot of people around you who think the same way. But at the same time, you being there isn't going to change much. Yeah. And then if you go somewhere else and you show people, oh, this is how you compost, or you set up a local library, those little libraries, so that people can share books instead of throwing them out. And then people can, start sharing books like that. Maybe that would increase community, or increase just people's thoughts on what sustainability within the community can be. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yes, very much so. And you make a great point too, that while it can happen on a political or governmental level, and that's very powerful, it can also happen more informally. If I'm going to start a buy nothing, Facebook page for my neighborhood, and we're going to share, kids' toys and books and clothes and things like that. And that way things aren't going into landfill, and people are spending less and buying less, and it's good. And I think it's easier to bridge cultural or philosophical, differences in a community with something like that everyone can agree on. It's better not to throw away stuff and get free stuff, right? That's not super controversial. And so again, starting in those types of communities can feel much more doable than, say, going to a city government meeting.
Yes. I've been to one and it was quite boring, and I'm not sure if I want to go again.
Absolutely. Yeah, it certainly can be. But, maybe that's the advantage, is that you can go and really spice things up, and then people will listen to you if you have something interesting to say about, parks in your neighborhood or something like that.
I have now moved to somewhere where they have lots of parks, and I don't think I would add any spice, to be honest.
Well, then maybe you need to move somewhere without parks so you can make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I'll talk to my partner about that.
Oh, yeah, it'll be a great idea, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I'd also like to maybe talk to you about, so you've talked about using your strengths to, influence your community, using things like blogging if you're good at writing, or social media if you're good at social media. But what about, if taking on some eco-friendly practices and, being within your community is a bit less inaccessible for you? How do you make the community more accessible and inclusive?
So as they say, variety is the spice of life, and offering a variety of options, or pursuing a variety of different options within a community, I think is the best way to make sure that it's accessible to everybody. So for example, tree planting is a fantastic community activity. These scientists are trying to find ways to suck carbon out of the air with all these expensive technologies. And it's like, hello, that already exists. It's called trees, and they're beautiful. And so that's a great thing to do. But so, sorry, let me back up. The scientists are really busy dreaming up these ways, right, to suck carbon out of the air, but that technology already exists. It's called trees. And there's also all of these mental health benefits, looking at increase property values, having more trees around, and the shade can help reduce that urban heat island effect. But that said, not everybody is physically able to pitch in to plant a tree, or they work the night shift and there's not any tree plantings, happening at different times of the day and so forth. And so that's why I think it is so important to empower everyone to use those unique skills and talents to contribute to those solutions. So I used to be really involved with a local climate action group in Texas, which, if you know anything about Texas, it's not the most climate-friendly, climate-forward state. And we had different working groups that were based on various interest areas. So there was a business and industry group that's focused on sustainable corporate practices and corporate social responsibility. And then there was a creative groups that did songs and arts and poetry. And there was a youth group who started a podcast. And again, one person cannot do everything, but one person can do something. And I think it's also really critical to point out about inclusion, that making sure that everybody has a seat at the table. So often we think about inclusion and accessibility with these types of things of who can participate in various events or outreach efforts. But just as important, if not more so, is who is making decisions, who is voicing their opinions when these things are being decided at the higher level. So often historically underrepresented or marginalized groups have been left out. And so ensuring that those decision-making bodies in your community, whether it be governmental, nonprofit, even informal leadership, is representative of the community that it's serving, I think is really key. And bringing up those new ideas and points that a less diverse group might not think about. So the climate crisis is a big problem, and we really need all hands on deck to address it. And so when those historically marginalized or vulnerable communities have now access to the same information, education, and resources that are needed to participate in and benefit from sustainability initiatives, that really helps to strengthen the initiatives in general. So sustainability means a different thing to a wealthy suburban community than to, say, a rural indigenous group. And there's different cultural practices and values and ways of understanding and interacting with the environment. And then there's also more buy-in. So I think that when we're doing advocacy, we want to think about not just tree hugging, green, let's save the environment, but also what's in it for the decision makers. Is this going to save us money in the long term or other positive impacts? And thinking about, if you're trying to influence or persuade someone, what matters to them and how can you connect a sustainability message to the values or incentives that they operate within.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so having a goal that you want to reach, but also finding, I guess, benefits for someone else as well, so that they agree to it, not just, I want to build public transport. It's going to cost everyone a lot of money, and it's going to disrupt you for a long time, and not maybe mentioning the benefits. Then you'll be able to, get to the city in 20 minutes instead of driving for an hour. Yeah.
Exactly. Finding common ground to be more persuasive in, hey, I want to do this not just because, a tree-loving hippie, but because this is going to make our air cleaner or save us money in the long term or open up more opportunities for business or that type of thing.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. So we're going to talk about now something that, you've learned from your work or your research. So what is a practice that you do to maintain your relationship with your community?
It's actually really quite simple, and that is knowing your neighbors. So there was a famous study out of Harvard University that was the longest running study on happiness. And they measured people for decades to see how much money did they make, what kind of careers did they have, what kind of marriages did they have, and so forth, and who was the happiest. And to boil it all down, the main finding was that the biggest factor that influences your happiness is your social support. And where are we, most often is usually in our home, in our household, maybe at work, right? Depending on what your schedule looks like. But hopefully we're all at home pretty often. And so getting to know those who physically live around you in the same apartment complex or the same neighborhood, whatnot, is a really powerful way to, first of all, have fun and be able to interact with people in a very convenient way. You could have a glass of wine and just walk home, right? But that social support is really good for you on a more serious level, especially when things go wrong and you need some support, whether it be a small favor. Hey, can you take in my trash bin from the curb while I'm out of town this weekend? Or keeping an eye out for safety, supporting each other. I think that having a strong community is really good for us as people, but is also the best way to build a foundation to then make things happen, like we've been talking about in terms of initiatives to have a more sustainable society. Because if I just knock on your door and say, "Hello, I'm Karen. We've never met before, but would you like to start a compost initiative in our neighborhood?" They're going to say, "No, thank you. Goodbye." But if they know me and know what I'm about and have that connection, it's so much easier to get the ball rolling on those types of things as well.
And I think particularly with neighbors, it's something that you can share as well. Because I was thinking as we were talking, and it's funny you brought up the compost. I was like, my apartment building doesn't have green waste. I kind of want to start a compost bin myself. If I started a compost bin, could I get other people to bring things in as well? And then the whole building can, participate in a composting, very small initiative. And that's a very small community. That's just my building, my apartment complex. It wouldn't work if I tried to do this with my family, who are my other support network.
Right.
They live on other sides of the city and they would never bring their compost all the way over to me.
Yeah, exactly. So just the physical proximity makes it easier, even if the social ties aren't quite as strong as it would be with friends, lifelong friends or family members. That geographic commonality can really make things like that a lot easier, even in other ways of reducing waste. So, for example, I'm very fortunate. My husband is a great cook and baker, and sometimes he'll make, a cake or something that is for an occasion that's too much for us, and then we'll have all this leftover that goodness knows we shouldn't be eating ourselves. And so I can call up my neighbor friends and say, "Hey, would you like a slice of pie or whatever?" And if they don't know me, again, they're going to be like, "No, what is in this? What are you trying to do to me?" But because there already are those relationships, we can do that. And it's social, but in a small way, it's also reducing food waste. And that's a little step towards a more sustainable household.
Thank you. And I guess, you've given a few examples of ways that we can use these ties. Do you have any other examples?
One way that having connections with your neighbors in particular could be helpful is more from a policy perspective. For example, I live in the desert and we have a homeowners association or HOA. And we decided as an HOA that we were going to outlaw grass because it's very water intensive. And in the area where we live, it's really just, not a good use of water. And it's common for people to use gravel or rocks in their landscaping instead of grass. If it was a very contentious HOA where nobody knew each other, that would have been a lot harder to move forward than a community where people know each other and they play bunco together on Thursday nights, and they have book clubs and a playground where the kids and the parents get together. So I think, again, just laying that foundation for people to be able to have a more productive dialogue about the issues that matter to them and coming out with a solution, rather than just being locked in conflict and not being able to get anywhere.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to maybe bake some biscuits for my neighbors soon.
Perfect.
Hopefully,
and then tell them if they don't like your biscuits that they can compost it in the bin that you've created.
Haven't created it quite yet.
I'm just counting. I'm already, counting on that to be what happens next.
No, I'll do the biscuits first, and then after the biscuits, I'll go around about the composting idea.
Perfect.
Got to make friends first.
Mm-hmm. One thing at a time. You're right.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your practice with us, getting to know our neighbors. I think really great to, get to know your community, learn about some of the things around your neighborhood, and also, maybe share some food around. I don't know about anyone else, but I would like to receive some leftovers. If our listeners want to find out more about you, where can they find you?
They can just Google me, old-fashioned search. I have a LinkedIn, so if you just search for Karen Magruder on LinkedIn, you should be able to find me and connect, and maybe we can work together on solving these issues.
Thank you so much. And if you don't want to Google, or if that's too hard for you, you can find the LinkedIn link in the show notes. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Joustra. Thanks for tuning in.